All right, so today I was planning on tackling a controversial subject. I don't know if you're even allowed to do that on YouTube these days. For those of you who haven't heard, David Wood's channel is it continues to be targeted by the YouTube Trust and Safety Council, which is one of these Orwellian euphemisms for a group of far left activists who are essentially censoring things that they do not find tactful in the current political climate. Hi, Alejandro. thanks, thanks for coming. And they're doing this across all sorts of platforms. The whole idea of cancel culture is something that's migrated from liberal arts universities and college campuses into the mainstream of society. And this was one of the problems when conservatives, particularly older conservatives who are more focused on political outcomes, scoffed at the people who were reporting on college campuses, the environment there. Uh, Distinguished speakers like Charles Murray being chased off of campus, or Heather McDonald being attacked, and the riots that occurred at Cal Berkeley. Hi, Marcus. No, I haven't read. I don't think I've read that. If it's recent, I'm probably not familiar with it. But all these sorts of things were kind of glossed over, particularly within among the right, as sort of inconsequential. The fact that they were occurring among this small subset of 18 to 23-year-olds, it really wasn't given much credence. But this is something that's manifested itself across the broader society. So now you have elected officials, politicians, people who are entrusted with power, basically giving into the demands in the same way that deans or provosts or college presidents recently and for the past few decades have been giving in to the demands of the students who pay their tuition. So the problem is they're elected to represent, ostensibly they're elected to represent the public, and the people who are paying them, i.e. the taxpayers, did not bargain for this. They didn't agree to an autonomous, self-contained um, communist society implanted in the middle of the city. So I think this is something that people are suddenly becoming aware of, that these ideas have consequences. They're not confined just to silly universities, and the fact that these colleges are the incubators for future decisions is something that I think is lost on a lot of people. Now, I wanted to talk about specifically the BLM, or the Black Lives Matter movement, because they're one of the outgrowths of critical race theory and deconstructionism, and these theories that have been percolating on college campuses for decades. And there's an aspect of it that is genuinely grassroots, but it really is kind of this synthetic movement that was born out of these ideas that you saw first on college campuses. Now, I want to distinguish between what Black Lives Matter is and previous civil rights movements. So, based on the name, you would assume that BLM is focused exclusively on obtaining civil rights or redress for African American citizens. You would assume that just based on the name and some of the iconography used and the messaging you hear, particularly from the mainstream media. You would assume that this was some sort of perhaps an identitarian civil rights group. Now, I think it definitely is an identitarian group, but not in the way it's perceived. It's not so much racial identitarianism as political or ideological um, sectarianism. So the fact that they might argue for some policies that might benefit black people in relation to to policing, and again, this is debatable, but that's merely incidental to their larger goals. So if you look at the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and you look at where they come from and what the goal they're agitating towards achieving, or goals rather, they're very unrelated to the broader black community and the prosperity of the black community. So some of the things they argue for are the deconstruction of the nuclear family, the abolition of the quote unquote patriarchy, so male headed households, fathers, they reject the idea of father led households, intact black nuclear families. They support transgenderism, the erasure of um, a, a dimorphous of a binary sexuality. So they want to erase the family. They want to erase gender slash sex differences. They're basically advocating the same type of goals that you would see from people like Shulamith Firestone or radical feminists, gay rights activists, particularly particularly the radical ones that were at the forefront of the movement. These are all variations on radical left ideology. They're opposed to the church. They're resolutely anti-Christian. So they want to kind of erase or deconstruct all of these pillars of the black community that kept it cohesive in spite of slavery, hundreds of years of chattel slavery, um, several hundred years of racial institutionalized discrimination, and uh, and other changes that other obstacles that they faced over over the past few centuries. So you can see it conflicts directly with the goal of advancing the black community, or enhancing the prosperity or the stability of the black community, particularly the attacks on fatherhood. When you have a country where so many people come from broken homes, and so many people have been adversely affected by the decay of the nuclear family, I the people in the chat can check me on these statistics, but I think something along the lines of 40% of white households are single parent families now, and I think the figures for the black community is 70%. But it's it's a huge issue, and one of the reasons you see a lot of these negative social and socioeconomic metrics in the African American community is the uh, the consistent attack on fatherhood, and this is not a an idea that sprung up uh, from the grassroots. That's This is something that's been germinated in the ivory tower, in academic circles, and it's been imposed upon the broader public. So it's really, so when you look at these goals, the means and the ends that BLM uses, they're really not a they're really not conducive to the thriving of the Black community. And I rather their objectives are derived solely from leftist kind of neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist Gramscian ideology. They don't have a lot to do with helping Black people survive or thrive in the United States. And and all you have to do to understand this is look back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And I'll take one figure in particular, that being Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X at the time was the main spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. Now, he worked under Elijah Muhammad. Later on, of course, he rejected Elijah Muhammad and he adopted a more orthodox version of Sunni Islam and spoke out against the Nation of Islam. And consequently, he was assassinated. But at the time, he was basically the spokesperson for a quasi Islamic cult. But when you look at what Malcolm X did as part of Black activism and civil rights activism, he didn't go and attack the church. He didn't delegitimize fatherhood. He didn't. In fact, he was willing to collaborate with Christian churches, Black Christian churches, on in furtherance of certain achievable goals. So even though he was basically the spokesperson for what is really a quasi-Islamic cult, it's not, and he wasn't part of the church. He didn't go out of his way to attack Black people who were Christians. He didn't try to deconstruct the Black family. He didn't do any of these things that BLM is doing. So you could you could argue very easily that he was part of the civil rights movement, and his main goal was to advance Black people. Now, you can critique the tactics and the strategy and whether or not his type of political activism was successful to that end. And that would be an entirely different video. But my point is, he no one could argue that his intentions were to help his fellow Black Americans. Whereas if you look at what BLM's intentions are, their focus is on advancing the cause of cultural Marxism, of 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 deconstructing and attacking the church and the family and the institutional pillars of not just the Black community in the United States, but America in general. That's their aim. And you see it not just not just by going to their websites and looking at what they enunciate very clearly, but also their actions and who they're collaborating with, who their allies are. You can see it. It's right in front of your face. So this media-driven narrative that BLM is simply trying to argue on behalf of Black Americans is incredibly misleading when you actually see what they're doing and what their underlying ideology is. And what's even more disturbing is that you have actual Christian churches who are getting behind the bandwagon, most likely out of a residual sense of guilt towards how Black people have been treated in this country. But the problem is they're getting behind a movement that is antithetical to Orthodox Christianity and is antithetical to the Bible, which should be what the Bible should be the bedrock of the Christian community, and to the extent and the church, and to the extent that the church engages in political what would be described as political action or acting upon its values, upon biblical values, um, that should be how they're guided. Yeah, I saw John Zemarek's. He wrote a couple of pieces for the stream. I actually met him. He used to come down to New York. He used to live in New York City. He's a cool guy. He has a lot of good ideas, and he's been interviewed by Eric Metaxas. He's kind of a regular on the Eric Metaxas show. For those of you who don't watch that show, and he has a lot of really incisive thoughts on this and other things. Oh wow, I didn't know that. That's awesome. Yeah, yeah. John's family is from New York, even though he doesn't live here any longer. But he's an interesting guy. But getting back to what I said, the church, it shouldn't yoke itself to an ideology that's antithetical to Christ in any way, even if even if certain people within the church feel guilty or feel obligated to support Black people. Getting behind a movement that is simply using Black people as a kind of like a veneer to enact their own really heretical, noxious ideas, which have nothing to do with the Black community. I think that's going to be a disastrous idea. Not only is it going to negatively impact the Black community and the country, it's also not going to enlarge the body of Christ. All of these churches that are getting behind, that are part of the woke church and getting behind social justice activism in a very ham-handed, superficial way, I don't think they realize that this isn't bringing prestige to the body of Christ. And eventually, these people are going to be pushed to reject Christ entirely, because the people they're aligning themselves with aren't going to be satisfied with simply denouncing white supremacy or systematic racism, or repeating these specific buzzwords that are going to force them to reject Christ, because that's their enemy. Their enemy isn't just um, white people or the white church or this. These are all simply representatives of the the person they truly detest. And like I said, BLM is resolutely anti-Christ, anti-Christian, and anti-fatherhood. It's not biblical at all. Even though I'm sure there are a lot of people who support BLM because they believe in in the message that's being packaged by the media. They probably sincerely support it because they think they're doing something to address police brutality or racial injustice. But again, this is simply a manipulation. It's social conditioning. The media's and academia, they're not being honest. They're not reporting what BLM actually believes. Um, so, I mean, being against racial discrimination or injustice or police brutality is something that most people would readily agree to. But when you actually pick beneath the surface, you understand what the motivations are. There was there was a Christian pastor, Matt Chandler, who went on a rant about this the other day. um, who went on a rant about this the other day, and he was castigating the church for not standing up for these issues and saying why, um, yes, definitely some of these people are evil and they have evil motives, but the church is really to blame because they're not getting out front on this. And he was basically saying the church should yoke itself to people who have an evil motive in order to, I guess, lead the fight for civil rights, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you read Ephesians, it says not to have, Paul says in that letter not to have any association with the works of darkness. So, in other words, even if you even if you have it in your mind that you can somehow lead this movement in a proper direction, you're not supposed to associate it with, because it's the works of darkness, and that's what it is, really. It's trying to impose cultural Marxism and the dissolution of the family, which has already had a disproportionately adverse impact on Black Americans. Uh, They're trying to make um, they're trying to make things worse. They're not trying to make things better. That's the real issue here, and I don't think a lot of people appreciate that because they see the name Black Lives Matter and they think this is an authentic civil rights movement intended to help Black people. When in reality, and again, I'm not saying this is true for every single person or even every single um, leader, quote unquote, of BLM. I'm sure there are many exceptions, but if you look at the core group, these are transgender and gay rights activists and radical Marxists. They're not. They may be Black, but that's not the central animating feature of their life. So I would just ask people to have some skepticism about what they're being told about this movement, which is at the forefront of the radical transformation of society that we're undergoing right now. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. I'll probably be back sometime in the next week. I know the videos are getting fewer and farther between, but I just want to mouth off about this for a few minutes, and I will see you next time. Have a good weekend.